Well, good evening, and welcome to Bozeman. On behalf of the Museum of the Rockies, I want to welcome you all and thank the Montana Historical Society for providing me the opportunity to come and speak to you tonight. Also, you may or may not know the mayor of Bozeman actually works at the Museum of the Rockies, so he says welcome to. Thanks for coming. Definitely appreciate that. Tonight what I want to do is just give you a quick outline of a pretty successful program that we've been running at the Museum of the Rockies for 2 years now, and it's called Hops in History. We're looking at the history of Montana brewing traditions, and we are kind of pairing that with a relatively new phenomenon, which is really the craft brewing craze. It's a fairly recent, I would say, cultural development that has really swept the entire country, the world to a certain extent, and certainly Montana. And basically what our program consists of is one night per month during the summer where we partner with a local brewery, and we have 7 in the Gallatin Valley right now, so we have several people to work with, where we basically have a fundraiser for our Living History Farm at the Museum of the Rockies. Our Living History Farm interprets basically agricultural lifestyles of the 1890s. And so this actually works pretty darn well. And the way this works out is people will come to this, they can sample beers from the local brewers, and then I will get up and talk for just a few minutes about brewing history. It kind of brings together 3 really important elements of Montana brewing history that I wanted to just leave you with those and emphasize to you. Again, the program's been pretty darn successful. We've had, 10 programs over 2 years looking at Montana history and different types of beer as well, and the histories behind where those types of beers came from. In spring of 2014, we inaugurated this thing, and we had no idea how it was going to work out. We figured we'd have maybe 40, 50 people if we were lucky at the first one. We had like 130. Within 2 months, we had 350 people, and had to actually cut it off because we couldn't handle that number of people. But we sell out almost every time. And what I wanted to do is hopefully emphasize to you that this is actually a pretty popular program, and it's something that would be applicable any place in Montana. And if nothing else, this evening I want to encourage you to look to your own communities and look at the brewing history stories that surround you, because they're all over the place in Montana. And also emphasize that there are really 3 reasons that our program has worked and why it could work for you too. The first one is this kind of craft beer craze. The idea that Americans can have a very broad array of different choices of different beers to taste. That's a relatively new thing. The second thing is Montana's own history. We've got great stories of pioneer brewers here in the state, and back in the day, back in the 19th century, pretty much every small town had their own brewery. And this could be good or bad, depending on the skill of your local brewer, and that's still, of course, the case today. But one of the things that we definitely had was a tremendous amount of variety, and that's something that the craft beer craze is really kind of bringing back. So that's the second thing. But the third thing is something that I have been surprised that few people have really picked up on, but is our own agricultural heritage here in Montana. Right now, as of 2014, Montana is the largest producer of malting barley in the United States, which makes us one of the largest in the world. We export heavily to breweries internationally, and this is not a new phenomenon. And that's something that I talk about in Hops in History, and hopefully I can share a little bit of that with you now. I mentioned that I kind of get up and talk for a little bit about brewing history, and one of the things people often ask me is, what makes you, how did you get involved in this? Have you been following this for a long time? I am not the top brewing historian in the state. He is here with us this evening, Steve Lozier, and I feel like I'm just maybe kind of promoting what he's already started here to a significant extent. He's gone around the state and already introducing people to our amazing brewing history, and I'm just kind of following in his footsteps a little bit. Steve, of course, has the Montana Brewing Museum over in Poulsen, and he wrote the introduction to a relatively new book, came out just a couple of years ago, by Ryan Newhouse, Montana Beer, Guide to Breweries in Montana. So I'm certainly not the only one who's been looking into this. If you are even if you're not a beer drinker, and I know everybody's not a beer drinker, and of beer drinkers, people can have pretty specific parameters of what type of beer they want to drink. But even if you're not involved in brewing, the consumption of beer in any way, you've undoubtedly noticed going to your local grocery store or mini mart that times have definitely changed in the beer aisle since the 1980s. Back in the 1980s, you'd go in there and you'd see Budweiser, Miller, Coors, and a few derivatives of those, like light beer and regular beer. But most of the beers that were produced and you could purchase in the United States, they were pretty light beers, lager beers, Pilsner beers. Both of those are German-style beers. But it hadn't always been that way. You go back in American history, back into the 19th century, and as I mentioned, every little town had their own breweries. That's because we didn't have refrigeration or pasteurization. And if you tried to keep your beer for too long or transport it over long distances, it would go bad. So every little town had their own little place. But Montana was a little bit different because from the pretty early days, we could produce barley here. And going back in Montana history, the first brewery that we know of in Montana was founded in Bannock in 1862, which is kind of interesting because the first gold strike was in Bannock in 1862. So clearly this was one of the first things that they jumped right on. And our first pioneer brewer is a guy named John Mannheim, and he was from Prussia. You will notice that almost all of the surnames of the brewers that I'm going to run through here are German, and there's a reason for that. Germany has one of the oldest brewing traditions in the world, and a very specific means of training them, which dates back to about the 1200s. And part of this is kind of an internship that you do as a brewer. If you're going to learn how to get into the industry, you start off in the carpentry shop, in the cooper shop, learning how to make barrels. And you work your way up to master brewer. And most of the brewers who came to Montana in this initial gold rush period, that's exactly where they came from. Mannheim was interesting because he was also a baker. And from time immemorial, going all the way back to the ancient Sumerians, who I talk about sometimes in Hops and History, going back about 12,000 years, there's this close connection between grain used for baking and grain used for making beer. In fact, if you go all the way back to the ancient Code of Hammurabi, this is way back in Sumerian times, one of the primary elements of this thing, it's the first written down, codified set of laws in all of Western civilization. There's a bunch of stuff about beer in it. And there's a good reason for that. I mean, the basis of Western civilization basically came out of the cultivation of grain. And what you find, Hammurabi talking about is how do you measure grain and how do you determine who gets to use the grain. And this was a very real concern that has continued to be kind of bubbling under the surface of brewing and politics up until the mid-20th century or so, because what was the tendency of people to do if they have a limited amount of grain? It's to use it all to make beer, which means you won't have any to make bread. The government, as early as 12,000 years ago, had to step in to determine who could brew and who would have the materials to bake. Germans, again, jumping back to those guys, they were the earliest Europeans to have this brewing tradition of using grains in this particular way to create beers. And we can go back to 800 AD, and we have archaeological evidence of the first German brewers, and they were making a material, and I'm not even sure I could call it an ale, but it was called a dark wheat ale that was flavored with oak leaves. This was found in the remains of an ancient beer amphora that was found in central Bavaria, dating from about 800 AD. So early traditions here. These are the descendants, the great grandchildren of these guys are the brewmasters who came to Montana, starting with this guy, John Mannheim. Oftentimes we hear that the first brewery in Montana is actually the Gilbert Brewery in Virginia City, and they were very close at hand. I mean, within just a few months, 1863, the next year, Gilbert starts brewing there. Again, his brewmaster, German guy, and he was someone who had gone through this rigorous training in Germany, was a brewer for about 8 years with the Gilbert Brewery, and then did the most Western thing he could possibly do, completely got out of the business and went into cattle ranching. But some of our other early brewers were right here in Bozeman. Jacob Spieth, Charles Krug, not of Charles Krug wine fame, by the way. They came to a very early city of Bozeman in about 1868. They'd met in Virginia City. They were both German brewers, and they came to Bozeman, set up a brewery right on Main Street, and you will see the second version of that still remains there today. The relationship between beer and water in these small towns is pretty crucial, because they used water both as an ingredient in the beer, but also for refrigeration. As I mentioned, today one of our more popular beers are lager beers. These basically came into being in the United States in the 1860s, 1870s. But lagering is actually a process. It means basically storing the beer, aging the beer. And because there are live animals in that beer, you have to refrigerate it. So these guys need refrigeration. The only way they can obtain that is either with flowing water or ice. And both of those methods were used both in Bannock, Virginia City, and Bozeman as well. So this became an important element. In the 1870s, we had another pretty important guy who came through, a guy named Andrew Hemrick, and he actually worked with Spieth and Krug here in Bozeman. Again, trained German brewmaster. He started out in Virginia City, moved down to Bozeman, and then met up with a local butcher, the son of a local butcher, a guy named Kopp, and decamped to the Seattle area, where he was a founder of a brewery there that went on to brew an important beer regionally that they called Rainier. So this is a guy whose early training was right here in the brewery in Bozeman, went on to be this major guy in brewing history out there. And an equally important person is a guy named Leopold F. Schmidt, another German, who came with his brother up the Missouri River in the mid 1860s as part of the gold rush coming up to Virginia City. They got to Helena. His brother stopped and got a job in a storefront. He went on to Butte, which in 1870 had a population of about 1,000. It was still a small silver mining camp, and he built some of the first buildings in Butte using his carpenter skills that he learned as an apprentice brewer. By 1876, the population had doubled, and he and a couple of pals in Butte realized this might be a good spot to build a brewery. And within about 4 years, the population had tripled. Within 10 more years, it was like a 10 times greater population. They kind of hit it at just the right spot. And they found a place called the Centennial Brewery. By the 1890s, they were advertising that they were selling 1 million glasses of beer a day. And of course, a mining town, huge mining town like that, that's the place for it. Now, maybe 1 million a day, that might be a little bit of exaggeration. Maybe on St. Patrick's Day. But again, this was a guy who really was a pioneer brewer here, and at the acme of his career in brewing in Butte, he sold out. About 1895, he decided he wanted to go and look at other possible brewery sites, and he ended up in a town called Tumwater, Washington. And he was the founder of Olympia, of the Olympia Brewing Company there. And interestingly, within just a couple of years of him leaving, the people that he had sold out to, who owned Centennial Brewing, started their own Olympia Brewing Company in Butte. The 1890s, again, just like at our Living History Farm, this is a very active period for brewing. We were producing brewers here who were going out into other markets and actually spreading the good word about Montana brewing. But they're also spreading the good word about Montana barley. And the 1890s was also especially important because of a group of outside brewers who came here from, of all places, New York City. And there was a group of brewers and their primary supplier of malt in New York City who realized there was a need for a more consolidated and more reliable source of barley than they could get even in New York City. Guy's name was Henry Altenbrand. He was the barley supplier, but it was the interest of his associates, a guy named Jacob Rupert and a guy named James Arrett. And these two guys were the brewing kings of New York. Arrett was the pioneer brewer of New York and built the largest brewery in New York in about 1850. It was over 72 city blocks in the northeast side of Manhattan. So very expensive real estate. And then about 8 years later, Jacob Rupert built another gigantic brewery almost right across the street. But although they were competitors, they worked together to get Altenbrand to find better barley for them. Supplies of barley apparently were pretty iffy in the 1870s and 80s, and by about 1885, they were talking about finding new sources for barleys. Again, these guys are German brewers. Both Arrett and Rupert were first-generation Americans. Both of their fathers had been brewers in Germany, and these guys were just taking up that mantle, and they had a great taste for these German types of malting barleys. One in particular called Saal, which is from the Saal region of Bavaria. They were very interested in obtaining this, but as you will recall in German history, during the 1860s and 70s, there's a lot of wars going on, a lot of unusual taxation things. It was very expensive for them to obtain it. And their other suppliers were Canada and some areas in the eastern United States, but they weren't getting the kind of quality they wanted. So they turned this project over to Altenbrand, who bought a large quantity of seeds, of Saal barley seeds, and then went to a few places in the United States hoping to find a place where they would grow well. He came to a little town called Moreland in the Gallatin Valley here in 1889 and after a little experimentation said, this is the spot. He got together with his associates, his brewing associates, and formed what was called the Manhattan Malting Company, named after the Manhattan Democratic Club, which all of the brewers were part of and were a major stockholder in. They purchased about 15,000 acres of land right around the town of Moreland and promptly renamed the town Manhattan. They built a massive malting plant there, and while Moreland was somewhat irrigated, the town was called Moreland after the Moreland irrigation project that had gone out there. These guys had so much more land now that they needed additional irrigation. And so, being in New York, being New Yorkers, they did what all New Yorkers would do. They got an agent, and their agent happened to be a preacher of the Dutch Reformed Church. And he actually found 50 families in Holland that wanted to come over to this brand new, unplowed, fertile valley and grow barley. Now, I thought, why Holland? Why these Dutch guys coming over? But if you think about it, what are the Dutch farmers very famous for? Their irrigation. And the first thing he did when he got these 50 families over here was he started digging irrigation canals. Within about 5 years, he had about 110 miles of irrigation canals that would pretty well irrigate what had grown to about 13,000 acres. He had the 50 Dutch families as well as his surrounding families all pouring magnificent Saal barley directly into their malting house. Within just a few years, they were winning awards. The Pabst Blue Ribbon label award for best barley in the United States, they won that in 1914. They actually started exporting their malt to Germany and to other places all over the United States. Their main base was in New York City, where they were sending much of their barley, but they started immediately selling to brewers in Bozeman, in Butte. They sold to Olympia in Tumwater, Washington. But within just a few years, they had created this gigantic empire that employed well over 1,000 people and was bringing tons of cash into the newly formed town of Manhattan. Of course, all of this came to a crashing end in 1919 with Prohibition. It wasn't an instant It wasn't this instant downturn because states, Prohibition was enacted on a state-by-state level. But as New York became a Prohibition state, obviously a major part of their business went down. In 1915, when Oregon and Washington went dry, they basically closed down the plant. And all of the 50 families, the 50 Dutch families, basically had to diversify. These guys went out of business. And the Dutch farmers had to go into, which they did easily because they were farmers, went into wheat, peas, and later potatoes. Those 50 families are the basis for the Holland community that's still just outside of Bozeman here. Towns like Amsterdam and Churchill. Churchill was supposed to be named New Rotterdam. And whenever I talk to my neighbors out there about that, I say, well, you should change it back. I mean, old New Rotterdam would be a great town for Montana. So, really, just really briefly here, we've already looked at our German brewing history here in the state. We've got a great connection with our brewing and agricultural and industrial culture here in Montana related to barley production. And of course, after Prohibition went away, they needed the barley again, and we became the major barley growers for the big breweries that survived Prohibition. Budweiser, Coors, Miller, all those guys. They're buying the barley, a lot of it up on the High Line, some of it down here in more southern, southwest area, but we continue to be a major supplier. So why now? Why beer? Why craft brewing now? In 1999, as recently as that, Montana changed their laws so that small brewers could come back. After Prohibition, most of these small brewers, the small timers, went completely out of business, and they were unable to come back. Some did. Gilbert Brewing came back to a certain extent. Lurkind, which was another German brewery here in Bozeman, they bounced back mostly because they had wisely received the Coca-Cola franchise for southwestern Montana. But most of these guys did not survive. And that led us to where we were shopping in the 1980s, where you only had these lager beers and the beers brewed in huge, massive industrial scale. In '99, when the law changed, allowing small brewers to come back and have tasting rooms, we had a few fits and starts. A few people tried to make it work, but it was a new thing. It took them a little while. But now If you have read the papers, you know that this has become a major industry in Montana. We have, I believe it's about 46 different breweries, small breweries in the state right now. They employ over 1,000 people. They bring in over $20 million a year from brewing from these small places. This is a bona fide industry, and it's not going away. The number of these places is growing and growing and growing. There was an article in the, in the Missoulian, it was back about maybe 2-3 weeks ago, that said, is there going to be a beer glut? Are we going to get to the point where we just have too many, that, everybody is being served beer, we don't need any more? And they came to the conclusion that no. Some places may go out of business, they might not be able to make it, but others will come into it. Nationally, in 2010, there were 1,813 small brewers in the United States. Today, there are over 3,500. Just in Montana, in 2010, there were 24 breweries. Today, there are 60, and more coming online all the time. It is in fact a real trend, and it doesn't look like it's going away, and it's a great thing for, again, Montana grain growers, because they're not just selling to these huge conglomerates anymore. They're selling to much more specialized places like Malt Europe, which is a malting company that's up in Great Falls that specializes in doing custom malting for small breweries. This is the kind of stuff you need if you're making all these different types of beers. You need different types of malts that provide different flavors, different textures. They're called different esters and different types of chemicals that give the very specialized types of flavors that people want for this broad variety of beers. So in a way, we're going back in time. We're going back to this idea that every town will have their own breweries and their own varieties. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, we have these same problems, which are that if you don't like the beer that your brewer is making, you may be out of luck. Unless you're in a town like Bozeman, where we've got 7 different brewers who at any one time will probably have 5 to 8 different types of beer. Somewhere in there, you should be able to find something that will be of interest. And of course, we'll always have the big guys. We're still going to have Budweiser and Miller. They're not going out of business anytime soon, but they're definitely feeling the pinch. And you'll see that these large brewery conglomerates, are starting to buy up small places because they recognize that is where the American public is going now. They want that variety. They want to be able to walk into the store and have like 80 different varieties of beers from every place from China to Hawaii to Mexico to Vermont to England to Czechoslovakia, Poland, Russia, even Japan. Every place is producing beer now, and the distribution is such that we're far, far beyond the time when we have to worry about the beer spoiling on the way between the brewery and the tavern. We can literally be tasting the same stuff that they brewed in Poland a week ago. So, as Americans, we love this idea of being able to have the variety, get what we want, and Montanans are going to be getting the benefits of that through increased demand for barley. We're number 1 right now for barley production. We're number 2 for number of breweries per capita in the United States, just behind Vermont, and we're always in the top 5 for beer consumption per capita as well. So we have a long history going on here. So just to wrap this up really quickly, I wanted to thank you for your attention here, but I also wanted to request that you look into your own local brewing histories and help guys like Steve and I try and spread the gospel of good brewing. It's good for history audiences, which are really pretty drawn to this fairly compelling story that's historical, it's economic, it's cultural for sure. And we think it's something that we could spread across Montana pretty easily. We have a few people who are experts like Steve, novices such as myself who can definitely steer you in the right direction if that's something you want to pursue. So help us out with this. One other last parting note, I would like to point out the oldest surviving brewery in the state of Montana is the Gilbert Brewery that's in Virginia City. And that is a spectacular historical spot, and it could really use an infusion of cash. Both the brewery itself, the bottling works, and Gilbert's house are there in almost the same condition as when somebody walked away from them in about 1915. Everything inside the Gilbert Brewery is, you can see how they were brewing beer there in 1863. The old brewing tuns are in there. We don't know if Charles Richter, the original 1860s brewer, is the one who made the actual barrels in there. But everything is there. The hop kiln, the refrigeration system. You could almost go in there and make beer today. It is that complete. Extremely rare. It's the only thing like that in all the northern Rockies, I can guarantee you. And you might be looking for some imploring, pleading from me sometime in the future saying, let's get together and preserve this thing. Now that we have an industry, a $20 million industry that is dealing specifically with brewing, though, we're hoping they might be able to chip in too. So I want to thank you again, and thanks so much for coming to Bozeman. It's been great being a host city here, and we hope to be seeing you soon, and keep an eye on that beer.